March 22, 1966. A Senate hearing room in Washington. Standing room only. Television cameras running live. Bobby Kennedy is in the room. At the witness table, James Roche, president of General Motors, the largest corporation on Earth. Senator Abraham Ribicoff holds up a report. It was produced by a private detective agency, paid for by General Motors. The investigators have been tasked with finding information to discredit a 31-year-old attorney named Ralph Nader, the man who had recently written a book about GM's car. Ribicoff asks Roche what Nader's sexual behavior and religious beliefs have to do with whether the Corvair was safe. Roche says nothing. Ribicoff puts the report down. Then, according to the book's own publisher who was in the room, Ribicoff said, "You hired detectives to get dirt on this young man to besmirch his character because of what he said about your unsafe automobiles. And you didn't find a damned thing." That exchange, on live television, is why every car sold in America today is subject to federal safety standards. And GM paid for the whole thing with their own money. But it started with a car, and with a cost-cutting decision made years before Nader wrote a word. Chevrolet's chief engineer Ed Cole pushes through a genuinely radical design. Rear-mounted air-cooled flat-six engine, all-independent suspension, unit body construction with no separate frame. In a showroom full of tail-finned, front-engine American sedans, the Corvair looked like it came from a different decade. Motor Trend names it Car of the Year for 1960. Time magazine puts Ed Cole on its cover. Chevrolet moves 26,000 units in the first 2 days on sale. Over 1.8 million Corvairs are built across a decade. The problem isn't the concept. It is one decision, made in one meeting, by one man who had never built a car. Here is what the engineering shows. The 1960 to 1963 Corvair used a swing axle rear suspension. One universal joint per side, at the differential. In hard cornering, centrifugal force drove the outside rear wheel to tuck under the body, positive camber, dramatically reduced grip, followed by sudden, violent oversteer. At the handling limit, the transition could occur in under 3/4 of a second. Faster than most drivers can react. The car carried 62% of its weight over the rear axle. That rearward bias made the tuck-under more severe than in lighter European rear-engine cars. The fix existed before production began. Porsche adopted a rear camber compensating spring in 1959, the year before the Corvair launched, to address exactly this problem. GM's own suspension mechanic, George Caramagna, recommended a front anti-roll bar. The front suspension was already designed to accept one, no structural rework needed. Cost and volume production, approximately $4 per car. GM chairman Frederick Donner, a career accountant who took over the company in September 1958, ran cost-cutting programs across the Corvair program. The anti-roll bar was cut. Donner's own stated philosophy, documented by Fortune magazine, "A car is a whole series of engineering compromises. You can't have everything." Without the bar, GM's workaround was a tire pressure differential. 15 psi front, 26 psi rear. Underinflating the front tires reduced front grip and partially compensated for the rear's instability. It worked, as long as you followed it precisely, but it required an 11 CI difference that no other American car used. And the Corvair owner's manual did not make the danger of ignoring this differential clear. If you inflated a Corvair's tires the same way you'd inflated every other car you'd ever owned, equal front and rear, you removed the only engineering workaround in the suspension. Here's the detail that makes this a cover-up, not just an oversight. Starting in 1962, GM quietly made the front anti-roll bar available as a regular production option, RPO 696. It was not advertised. Dealers were not told to recommend it. If you ordered the heavy-duty suspension package, you got the bar. If you ordered a standard Corvair, you never knew the safer version existed. GM had the fix. They charged extra for it, and they didn't tell anyone it was there. Before Ralph Nader published one word, GM already had 100 lawsuits pending from Corvair crashes. November 1965. Ralph Nader publishes Unsafe at Any Speed. He is 31 years old, working as an unpaid advisor to Senator Ribicoff's subcommittee. Chapter 1. The Sporty Corvair, the One-Car Accident, focuses specifically on the models from 1960 to 1963. Nader names George Caramagna, the mechanic who recommended the stabilizer bar and was overruled. He documents that management cut a known fix for cost. Initial sales: modest. Not a bestseller. Most Americans had not read it. Here's what almost no one tells you. GM had already killed the Corvair 6 months before the book came out. In April 1965, GM issued an internal memo freezing all Corvair engineering development. The Camaro was already in development. The 1965 Corvair, with its fully redesigned independent rear suspension, was already a dead car walking. Nader's book didn't kill the Corvair. GM's own boardroom killed it 6 months before he published a sentence. Nader just told the public what they'd been driving for 5 years. GM's response to that was the worst corporate decision in automotive history. GM hired private investigator Vincent Gillen to investigate Ralph Nader. The mandate, documented in Gillen's sworn testimony, was to find information to discredit Nader as a congressional witness. What GM authorized: physical surveillance of his movements, investigation of his sex life, religious practices, and political affiliations. His credit rating, his personal relationships. Gillen's agents approached Nader's Harvard Law School professors under the false pretense that he was being considered for a lucrative job. Multiple women reportedly approached Nader to solicit sexual encounters in what appeared to be entrapment attempts. They found nothing, not one piece of useful information. Washington Post reporter Morton Mintz published the first story on February 13, 1966. By March, it was national news. Ribicoff called Roche to testify. On March 22, 1966, live on television with Bobby Kennedy in the room, Roche admitted everything and apologized. His exact words on the record: "I am not here to excuse, condone, or justify in any way our investigating Mr. Nader. To the extent that General Motors bears responsibility, I want to apologize here and now to the members of this subcommittee and Mr. Nader." Before the hearing, Unsafe at Any Speed had modest sales. After Roche apologized on live national television, it became a bestseller. The surveillance operation GM paid for to suppress the book is what made the book famous. Nader sued General Motors for invasion of privacy. In August 1970, General Motors settled for $425,000. Nader's public comment: General Motors was financing their own ombudsman. Newsweek wrote that the settlement would in effect serve as General Motors' contribution to the consumer movement. Nader used the money to found the Center for Auto Safety, the organization that petitioned NHTSA to investigate the Ford Pinto's fuel tank in 1974. The settlement check General Motors wrote to bury the story funded the watchdog that pursued their entire industry for the next 50 years. In Congress, the Safety Act passed the Senate unanimously. President Johnson signed it September 9, 1966. That law created the framework from which NHTSA emerged, empowered to set mandatory safety standards, investigate defects, and force recalls of every vehicle sold on American roads. The same agency forced the Ford Pinto recall. It also investigated the Takata airbag and reviewed Toyota's software. All of it traces back to one senator who placed a private investigator's report on a table in March 1966. In 1971, NHTSA conducted a comparative handling test, the 1963 Corvair against the Ford Falcon, Plymouth Valiant, Volkswagen Beetle, and Renault Dauphine. An independent 3-person engineering panel reviewed the findings. Conclusion: published August 12, 1972 by the U.S. Department of Transportation, the handling and stability of the Corvair from 1960 to 1963 does not result in an abnormal potential for loss of control or rollover, and is at least as good as some contemporary vehicles, both foreign and domestic. 3 years after the last Corvair was built. Technically correct, completely useless. Nader's own book had acknowledged that the 1965 redesigned Corvair addressed the suspension problems. He was writing about the early models, but newspaper headlines never made that distinction. The 1965 Corvair, praised by car and drivers David E. Davis Jr. as the most beautiful car to appear in this country since before World War II, was destroyed by the reputation of a car it no longer was. The last Corvair, an Olympic Gold Monza coupe, rolled off the Willow Run line on May 14, 1969. Total production: 1,835,170. This story gets told as a simple arc. Nader exposed a bad car. GM panicked. America got safety laws. Clean, satisfying, and incomplete. The real story is 4 scandals stacked on each other. First, GM's own suspension mechanic, George Caramagna, identified the problem and recommended the $4 fix. The car was already built to accept it. Donner deleted it. Then GM quietly sold the fix as an unadvertised option, RPO 696, without telling dealers or buyers it existed. Second, the workaround was a tire pressure setup so unusual that inflating the tires normally made the car more dangerous. Over 100 lawsuits were filed before the book. Third, when a 31-year-old lawyer put all of this in print, the world's largest corporation hired a detective to investigate his sex life in front of the United States Senate on live television and found nothing. Fourth, the $425,000 privacy settlement funded the organization that pursued GM's entire industry for 5 decades. The boardroom didn't just lose the fight. They deleted a $4 fix the car was built to accept, hid the safer version behind an unadvertised option, built a surveillance operation that made the critic famous, funded their own watchdog, and helped create the agency that now governs every car they build. And the car they were protecting? They had already killed it themselves. 6 months before Nader published a word.